Be live. Let's see if it actually records this time.
You got this done yet?
I'm getting started, man.
What was that chair? Okay, guys, let me get by.
Try not to bump that. Still got a few minutes, so we can get it set up so that oh, great. Yeah, I got it. It's fine. There's a blank there. I'm not going to trip over it. I'm just going to let me go upstairs and we're about to start. Hey, okay, I get it. Could you go upstairs and let people know if they're going to run downstairs to turn their train off when they're going through Croker? Yeah, or their sound off, rather. They can keep running, but, yep. Okay, yeah. All right, wait for Dave to come down. I'll go ahead and get started. All right, everyone got chairs? If you need a chair, there's some back over in the aisle by Columbia. All right, but we're gonna go ahead and get started. Shut that door. Yep. Is this okay? Yeah, we're good. Yep. All right, so thanks for coming again, guys. We're basically going to start over right where we left off. So you can see this is the module that we started last month. I have gone through and done a few steps already just to prepare, because a lot of what we're going to do today, if you were to do it step by step, it would take multiple days. So just doing some steps that I can show you multiple steps at a time, and you're not here for just 5 minutes. What we're going to work on today is basic ground cover. I'm going to show you how to use Sculpted Mold plaster to sort of smooth over terrain between your foam. We're going to show you how to paint the plaster once it's set up. And then once your paint's dry, I'm going to show you how to use real dirt and tile grout as your base layer for ground cover. Because it's hard to make anything more realistic than dirt than just real dirt. But to get started, like I mentioned, the first thing we're going to do is going to put a screen coat of Sculpted Mold plaster on top of all this foam. That's what this white stuff is here. And you can kind of see, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and pass this around. You can kind of see the texture of what that does, whereas the foam is very smooth, except for where you carve the rock. The plaster sort of evens out all the contours, and it also adds a bit of lumpiness to the surface, makes it look a little bit more natural, a little bit more uneven. It is Sculpted Mold. So this is what Sculpted Mold is. What Sculpted Mold is, it's a plaster mix similar to hydrocal, if you ever use that for rocks, but it has a paper fiber, like basically ground up paper pulp, mixed into it, and it gives it a little bit more stiffness. It acts kind of like a paper mache, and so instead of just flowing and sort of glooping like normal plaster would, this kind of holds its shape. And it's also responsible for this kind of lumpy texture that you get there that makes it look a little bit more natural. And so what we're going to do, very simple to use. They're fine as long as they turn it off when they're going through Croker. It's fine. We're in a club. There's going to be a little bit of noise. So all you need for the plaster stuff is obviously you need the Sculpted Mold plaster. There's various different brands of this. Just look for the name Plaster Modeling Compound, and as long as it looks like kind of a plaster with kind of a pulpy paper mix, it's the right stuff. Some of them set up a little bit differently. Like we've got Celluclay in the back. That tends to take a lot longer to set up, but the end result is basically the same. You're going to need a container to mix it up. Anything will do. It's going to get messy, so if use something that you don't mind either using just for plaster or throwing away.
You want some newspaper?
That would actually be a good idea. Get some newspaper or paper towels, because this is a little bit messy. Also plastic gloves. This isn't toxic or anything. That's a little bit wimpy, but it'll work for cleanup, I guess. This isn't toxic or anything, but it does tend to get on your hands, and if you get on your hands, there's a chance you're going to get it on your furniture. So, yeah, if you could just flip that right underneath there. You can just put it underneath this left half there, and that should be plenty. Yep, that's plenty. That's plenty. Yep, because I'm only doing this half. And then you need water. And you need applicators. There's a few ways you can do this. You can just use your fingers if there's some troublesome areas, but the best tools are going to be simple, cheap plastic putty knife and popsicle sticks. That's all you need. So all cost here we're looking about is about $15 a bag, dollar plastic container, then like a couple cents for these. So very, very affordable. So what we're going to do, I'm going to start with the Sculpted Mold here. This is messy, so make sure that you're working somewhere where you can easily clean up, so that you don't mind getting messy. I'm going to take about a handful here. You can kind of see the texture here. You can see the paper fibers coming out. I'm just going to put that in the container, like that. And that really should be enough for what we're doing here. If not, there's a little bit of working time here, so you can always make more. But then what we're going to do is open up the water, and you want to just saturate the plaster. You don't want it runny. You just want to kind of pour it in and then start mixing it until it's about the consistency of like a thick oatmeal is what you're going for. You can go a little bit thicker if you really need it to stick on a slope or something and hold its shape, but that also means it's going to set up a lot faster. Now, as far as that goes, Sculpted Mold, again, it depends on what brand you use, but Sculpted Mold in particular has a working time of about 20 to 30 minutes. And the longer it sits, the harder it gets. But then it takes anywhere from 24 to 48 hours to fully cure, depending on how thick you set it. A thin layer will probably take less than a day. If you put down like an inch or more in a place where you need to fill, it's going to take a couple days. So that's why I sort of prep this here, because you need to have time, just like concrete or plaster, it needs time to cure. But you can kind of see, that's the kind of consistency we're working with here. This is a little bit on the thicker side, but you can see it's kind of a thick oatmeal-y consistency. It's kind of like cottage cheese, actually, is a good comparison.
Technique. Something to think about too is when you're mixing it, you can add watercolor paint to get the brown or the green throughout.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you can add color to it to make, because you can see here it's very stark white once it dries, and it can be a little bit hard to cover up. But yeah, and then all we're going to do, we're just going to start pouring it onto the surface. You actually put a lot more than that. And then we're going to use our applicator, just kind of spread it out. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to go all over this hill, all over this area. I'm going to blend this area. I'm going to leave the road area smooth so that we have a flat bed for when we go back into our roads on a later date. You can see I just kind of gloop it on and then spread it out. You don't need much. If you're just coating foam like this, you can get away with about 1/8 of an inch, and then obviously that'll make it go a lot longer and it'll dry a lot faster. So you'll get back to doing all the fun stuff. Not to say this isn't fun. there is kind of like a kindergarten joy to messing with this stuff, but it is sort of it can take a while, especially if you've got a large area to cover. But you can kind of see what's happening here. Whereas before we had this perfectly smooth, almost shiny hill, now I have some sort of natural lumps and bumps in the terrain to make it look more natural. And I'm also going to so you can see I already put the cork roadbed down. I glued that down the same way I glued the foam. I used the liquid nails, the Loctite construction adhesive, and just glued it right onto the foam with the exact same stuff. Really nothing fancy there. But now it does kind of leave a stark edge, which isn't always a bad thing. You can always smooth it off if you want to have that appearance of a high roadbed. But we can also come back. You can see I'm sort of coming up to the edge of the roadbed there, trying to blend it in a little bit. Trying to make it all look like one continuous lump of dirt. One thing I'm noticing, Dave, this also sticks to the foam a lot better than the celluclay does. I was trying to use the celluclay last night, and it was just sliding right off. Not last night, earlier this week. Yeah, if you want to see what this looks like in large scale, you can head upstairs and look at Tom's mine that we're working on. That's basically this, but at a much, much larger scale. But yeah, you can see there now this hill. I'm going to bring it up to the edge here. Smooth it out. And if it's being a little bit messy, you can just take your finger and kind of spread it out there. But again, once you do this, you have to be careful what you touch, because it is plaster. And you also get, if it's too bumpy, you can sort of use that to bump it, get the bumpiness out. But there's another method to get it even smoother that I'll show later for this front half, where we're going to have a building. And if you're having a building or anything that you're going to have like a dirt road, it's obviously going to be a lot more compacted, a lot more smooth. So it's still going to have a little bit of texture from just because it is earth. But we're going to want to go back and sort of refine it a little bit. Now we're going to the big lump here. There we go. Smoothing it out, don't need very much. And we're actually to the point here where I think this is a large enough area. I'm going to go to the putty knife here, add a little bit of water just to make it slide over. There we go. Like I said, this is where we're going to have our building. We're going to have sort of a small diner or restaurant or something.
Is this yours, Gordon? Yeah. Come here. Hang on just a sec. I'm going to move you. You're moving.
At one point, the roadbed normally has a ditch on either
Yep,
side.
I was just about to mention that.
Yeah, you
Yep.
should be clearing that out.
Yep, so I was going to come back and do that. Don't worry. Yeah, you can kind of see it does kind of have trouble sticking to the foam sometimes, kind of slips, but just be patient and we'll get there eventually. There we go. And honestly, should be enough to finish up. Just need a little bit more for. I'm just going to kind of push in shape. I can actually kind of spread this out a little bit more, make it do its job. There we go. And you can kind of see the consistency.
Off the edge if you need.
Yep, I understand. I see it. Yep, and that's a great thing about working it while it's smooth. You can kind of clean it up. I actually try to wait until it's a little bit firmed up before I start cleaning up the edges, because again, it firms up. It doesn't quite harden within the first 20-30 minutes, but it sort of gets firmer. It sort of gets a consistency closer to like a clay, and at that point, it's actually a lot easier to do cleanup and also smooth it out. Exactly. I'll put a little bit here, and a little bit here. But simple as that. Just sort of slap it on, smooth it out. And I'm not going to worry too much about how it looks like back here, because this is toward the back edge, and this is all going to have bushes and trees and all that sort of stuff covering up anyway. So as long as it doesn't have to be a perfect coat, but just enough to sort of make it look natural. All right, and then like George mentioned, you usually have a ditch alongside the roadbed. So I'm just going to start by just taking my thumb here. And I will come back once it starts setting up which shouldn't take very long at all. There we go. You can see there's a nice little ditch there, and I'm going to pull back there to smooth out that edge. There we go. Just like that. And now you can see, whereas before we had a pretty stark looking hill, that's starting to look pretty natural. Just like that. All right, now once it's, like I said, curing time, working time's about half an hour. Curing time's closer to a day, depending on how, this will probably take closer to like 12, 16 hours, this little amount. But if you got a lot or you got some thick fill, it could take a day or two. So normally, this would be the end of the clinic because we just have to let that dry. But luckily, here's some I made earlier. So once this is set up, you can come over and we're going to paint it. The reason we do that instead of just going straight to the dirt is obviously if you just put the dirt on, because this is stark white, or even if you do mix it the paint, it's going to be a really light brown. It's going to be really obvious when there's a hole in the dirt. If you do a quick cover coat of paint first, even if it's not, you can see it's not even the same color as the dirt we're going to use, but because it's closer to an earth tone, if there is a hole in your dirt, which there will be, it's impossible to get it all, it's a lot less obvious, and it's just going to be a lot more continuous instead of having a big white patch in the middle of your dirt. And luckily, it's actually very simple. So you can kind of see one thing I've already gone. I've colored everything that's going to be stone from last time with, like I mentioned, this is the Krylon Foam Safe Primer. It comes in a light gray. They sell it at Michael's. It's a little bit more expensive than normal spray paint. I think this is like 10 or 15 bucks. But the advantage of this is that it does not melt foam. Normal spray paint will melt right through it. And you can kind of see this actually melts it a little bit. If you look really close, there's little pock marks and stuff. But in our case, it actually looks kind of natural. But it melts it a lot less than normal spray paint does. And then once you have that primer on, you can go over with all your shades and stuff. And we're actually going to go over that too. I forgot to mention, I'm also going to demonstrate how to, so this is our base coat for the rocks, but it looks pretty tame, pretty stale. We're going to show you how to do washes on it to make it look a lot more natural. I'm going to go ahead and take this bridge out so that we don't mess it up, even though it's already a little bit crusty. This is from Rapidan, by the way. Yep, reusing. So this is very simple. You do not need to use expensive paint for this. It's all going to get covered up and there's no artistry to this. All you need is that cheap dollar bottle craft paint, or if you've got some house paint, water-based latex, not oil-based solvents, because again, it might melt the foam. But just cheapest brown paint you could find.
One tip, go to the rejects at Lowe's or Depot, and you may be lucky enough to find a brown paint or something.
Yep, that's a good tip. Yeah, because again, this doesn't have to be a specific color. It doesn't even have to really match what you have. It just has to be good enough that it covers up the plaster. And that's all. So yeah, if you can find a cheap reject for like $1, go for it. And it'll last you forever because you do not need much. So I'm just going to take normal paintbrush. I dip it in water first just to make sure it flows a little bit better. Just going to dip it in the paint here. And then if you can paint your walls, you can do this. Literally just slap it on here. I'm going to go up a little bit into the road here where I don't have plaster, but just because we're going to put dirt there too at some point. And I've seen methods where you actually mix glue with the paint and then you go right into the dirt without letting it dry. But I'm not sure how well that actually works. And the guy I saw it from, Luke Town, he went back to doing the paint and then letting it dry and doing the glue afterwards. So I don't think it works as well. But if you press for time, you might be able to try that, mixing white glue directly into the paint. But again, I'm not sure if I would try that myself. I'm actually going to go up into the road because this is all going to get covered. But I want to make sure that it gets in there beforehand. Then back here. Again, no artistry to this. You're not worrying about shading, or this is literally just like coloring book stuff, trying to get all the white. I actually probably went a little bit heavy here, but I'll spread that out. You can see what I've done here. I'm trying not to hit these walls. Oh, looks like I've actually gone a little bit over there, but that's fine. It's all right. That's why we can always go back with coat and clean that up. But honestly, that kind of once we go back with stains on that, it probably won't look too bad. But what these are? This is just the foam cord, same stuff I use to make these walls, and those are forming our abutments for our bridge. Actually, foam's really got a lot of uses to it. All right, looks like we're kind of running there, but that's fine. All right. And then once we get toward this bottom here, we don't need to get super clean because this is all going to have rocks on top of it. So this is just to clean up that edge. All right, there we go. Simple as that. You might need a second coat depending on how thin you put your first coat. And then one thing I am going to go through, I'm going to take this smaller brush. And I'm going to see if there's any spots I missed and just sort of touch up. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect and clean. Just enough that you can make sure there's not too many white spots poking through when we put down our dirt. Simple as that. All right, there you go. Just like that. All right. And now, before I move on to the dirt step, I'm going to show you how to stain rocks. There's a few ways you can do this. This works for both plaster and foam. I'd actually say it works a little bit better for plaster because it soaks in the water a little bit better, but it still works pretty good for foam. So you can use it for either. There's a couple ways to do it. Woodland Scenics makes a stain kit that has a whole bunch of different shades, and all you do is you just crack open the can and dab it on. If you want to do a little bit more cheaper and homemade, here's how I do it. This is acrylic ink. You buy it at Michael's or any art supply store. About $5 a bottle, but one drop goes a long way. I've got both black and brown here. I'm going to use mostly the black, not just brown, raw umber is the exact tone. This is acrylic, yeah, so you mix it with water. So there's two different types of ink. There's acrylic ink, there's India ink. India ink you're going to want to thin with isopropyl alcohol. Acrylic ink, if you put in isopropyl alcohol, it'll just flake up and it'll look terrible. You thin the acrylic ink in water. So make sure when you buy the ink, you know which type you're getting. It should say on the bottle whether it's acrylic or not. But I'm just going to add, let me actually do the water first. Don't need them much because we're just going to do, we're basically doing a wash, a stain here. And then the ink is really strong, so start with just a couple drops. And you can see, I just added a couple drops there. It's already pure black. So start with that and then work up. Because you can always add more ink. You cannot remove ink once it's in the jar. So I'm going to take this cheap foam brush. I'm going to test it on always test somewhere that's not as obvious before you move toward the front. And that is actually pretty close. And so I'm just going to dab this onto the surface. I'm going to soak it into the brush. And this is a little bit on the weak side actually, but that's actually good because that means you can actually you can build up the coats. I'm just going to add a little bit more ink, but you can build up the coats and have darker areas and light areas. But what this is going to do for us is it's going to add depth to the rock. It's going to add shadows, because that's one thing when you're working with miniatures, is that shadows don't cast nearly as deep or as starkly on miniatures, excuse me, as they do on large scale objects. But by using a wash, we can sort of simulate those shadows. And so I'm just going to dab all over the surface of the rock here. And we're going to have, if you have some puddles, just kind of soak those up. I'll come around. And one thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is you're kind of simulating how water will flow over the rock over time. And so when you're looking at your rock, think about where the water is going to run and where it's going to pool up naturally. So say for this rock, I've got a shelf here and a shelf here where the water's going to want to naturally pool. So I'm going to actually go in and really press in with the ink here. And I'm going to go back and do this multiple times. So it really looks like the water sort of sat there and dirt and sediment has deposited. And there's been like algae growth. And then same thing for these cracks here. Usually those are natural fissures in the rock, but then they get widened because water gets in, freeze-thaw cycle, breaks it apart, and that's just a natural spot for water to run down. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take my brush, run it vertically, and just press it in and just naturally let it flow down. We can already see this is, again, a pretty weak first coat. We can already see how the shade is changing, and the detail in the rock is really starting to pop out. And I'm just using the black here to start off with. And honestly, for a lot of like limestone or granite, you might be able to get away with that. But and a lot of times, there's lots of different inclusions in rock. So you get lots of different shades, even if it's like a single limestone. You'll have spots of, like I'm thinking of, I have to represent my home school, my alma mater of Virginia Tech, but their Hokie stone is a local limestone in that area that has lots of different colors in it. There's blue grays, there's warm grays, there's tans, there's reds. All because there's different minerals spread all over the rock. And so you can use a technique called Leopard Spotting, where I'm just going to demonstrate with the raw umber here. Raw umber. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Crack this open. Just put 2 or 3 drops in here. Add a little bit of water. You can see this is kind of more a brown tone. So if you want to have like iron deposits, you can add, but I'm going to do what's called leopard spotting, where I'm just going to literally go over random spots. Boop, boop, boop. And that'll kind of simulate there being random inclusions in the rock and add just a little bit more tone variety. And just literally, there's no real strategy to this. Sort of dab it all over. And we're going to go back once it's dried, had a chance to dry, and do this again and again until we get the sort of the tone we want. But you can already see that rock is looking a lot more detailed, a lot more realistic than it did just a few minutes ago. I'm going to actually go through and do the same thing to this rock wall here, because usually these rock walls are cut from the same home stone that the rock in the same area is, because that's the cheapest way to do it. And so you can usually color it a very similar way. And this is, you can see it's going to make that texture really pop up. It's going to soak into the lines there. Yep, there we go. And really make the detail stand out.
Oh yeah, I was saying what?
I'm going to clean up some of the puddles here. All right, cool. Like I said, I'm going to go back and do that in multiple stages. Well, that's already a pretty good start. So now I'm going to take my paper towel here and just soak up the excess. You can also do the same thing for concrete, but concrete is obviously a little bit different. You're not going to have the mineral inclusions, but you are going to have the water runoff. So for concrete, you're going to want to do streaks. Usually find a corner or something, or think about where the water would naturally sort of run off. If you've got a crack carved into there, obviously make sure the stain gets into that crack. And just to make it give it a more weathered appearance. Yeah, I got you. Thank you. I'm actually going to let some of those puddles sit, because they'll sort of, there we go. That's pretty good. All right. Now we're already ready for the final step, which is dirt. So like I mentioned, it's really hard to find a better substitute for dirt than real dirt. So what this is, you may have heard of what I did for the Rapidan project. What I did is, before I started that project, I actually drove out to the real Rapidan out just north of Charlottesville. And I took pictures for reference of the mill that's there, of the houses, of the river, of the weir. And you can see a lot of that represented. One thing I also did is that I found some public land and actually scooped up a big container of actual Rapidan dirt. That is what this is. Because you can just get dirt from your backyard and that will work just fine. The thing about the dirt around this region is that it's all sort of a gray, sandy silt, which can work fine. And you'll find, even within a small geographical area, you'll find multiple different areas of dirt. But what we don't have around this area very much is this very red, iron-rich clay, which you find a lot out west of the state a lot of times. And so I actually wanted to get, just as a color reference, get that. But it also is mixed into here. Now you will notice, this is how it comes out of the ground once I dried it. That's a lot lighter. The reason for that is, once we glue it down, you know how when you get something wet, it tends to get darker? The same thing happens when you put it in glue, but that when you put it in glue, it's permanent. So anything you glue down with the scenic glue, which, by the way, in this particular case, I'm using a 50-50 mix of glue and, well, it's 70-30. You want a little bit thicker for this stage, so that it can stick to slopes. But it will always be like a shade or two darker than what it looks like before you glue it down. So I take this is tile grout. This is called, the shade's called Biscuit. Yeah, I'll try to be careful because, yeah, this does get everywhere. But you can see this is a very, very light beige color. And I mix this into the dirt. It's going to be different depending on what shade you use and what shade you're trying to get to. But right now, this is a ratio of about 3 to 1. 3 parts real dirt, 1 part grout. And what that does is that lightens it up just enough so that when I apply the glue, it sort of goes back down to where I want it to be. It sort of compensates. This is just light enough that it'll get back down to the color I want. All right, so now we're going to actually put it on here. And this is going to be a little bit messy, but I never claimed that scenery is going to be clean. So,
You need to rub alcohol.
not for this one, because that's not going to dry in time for me to actually do that step. I'll explain it, but yeah. So we're going to apply it all in this area. So on top of our mountain here, and where our field's going to go. Very simple. I'm going to prep the dirt first. I'm going to take this little plastic paper cup, dump it in there. And we want just the finest of the finest powder. If you just dump it straight out of the cup, you're going to get lots of bigger particles that look out of scale. And so what we're going to do, this is a stocking. This is nylon pantyhose. But this has very, very fine holes in it. So if you stretch this out, put it over the cup, you'll make sure that only the finest, finest powder comes out, which is exactly what we want. You can come back, and I actually am going to, before we even start, I'm going to put the glue down first, but I'm going to put a little tiny bit of this sort of medium grit, coarse grit dirt to sort of represent boulders and stuff that's embedded in the dirt. But I'm going to put that down first and then put the dirt around it so that it looks like it's in the dirt rather than sitting on top of it. All right, and now for the easy part. I'm going to take this, again, this is just white glue and water. And if I did this right, I can't remember if I mixed it or not, but you add 1 drop of liquid soap or a couple drops. What that does, it breaks the surface tension so that instead of beating up, it flows a lot better.
I think they may have seen that.
It's actually okay for this to be a little bit on the thicker side.
No, I think I thinned it when I used it.
Oh, well, it'll still work. It'll work for the demonstration. If it breaks, I can always go back.
Okay.
Right, so we're just going to take, I'm actually going to use a different brush because that's got the stain in it. Make sure you use a cheap brush for this because the glue will dry. Even if you clean it out really, really well, it'll stiffen up the bristle. So make sure you get a cheap brush that you don't care about. But I'm just going to take the glue and go over everywhere where I'm going to put down dirt. So make sure you put a lot on the slopes because obviously that's where it's going to have the hardest time. You might want, if you're doing a module like this, it might be a good idea if you've got a steep slope, while you're gluing it down, sort of tip it up so that it has less of a chance of rolling down the slope. I think this case is going to be fine, but we will see. Yeah, this actually might be a little bit on the thin side. So I'm going to run, if you can go get either the white glue or the Mod Podge, I don't care which. just to thicken it up a little bit. Yeah, because when you put down your first coat of dirt, you want it to be a little bit on the thicker side because you want to be able to grip onto the slope there. Afterwards, this is going to be, so this mix, I believe, is, 3 parts water, 1 part glue, roughly. And that's good for basically all your normal scenery work because it'll flow in between the, in between the particles and really embed in there. Yeah, but for this first coat, I'm going to go a little bit thicker, so. Yeah, this is just Elmer's white glue. Yep. Buy this by the gallon. Some people say Mod Podge is a little bit better, and I actually do use that a lot. But when it's a lot more expensive. This is, how much is this for a gallon, Dave? Like a few bucks?
Yeah.
Mod Podge, like a quart, is like 40 bucks. So this is obviously a lot more economical. All right. Yeah, this is a lot. Yeah, this is going to work better. You're kind of looking for the consistency of like cream. I think is a good analogy for the first coat. There you go. It's already a little bit thin because of our first coat, but it should still work. If not, I'll go back and fix it later, and no one needs to know the wiser. Then do the same thing on top of here.
The brown is just paint.
Just brown house paint. You can use craft paint as well, whatever you have, whatever's cheapest. It's just a base coat, again, so that if there's a hole in your dirt layer, it's not super obvious.
Right.
Which is especially important for these slopes because, like I mentioned, it has a tendency to kind of want to roll down them. So, and you do want to be a little bit careful with this. Make sure you don't get any glue where you don't want dirt, because obviously it's going to be glued there forever. So you don't need to be super careful because, you know, dirt does have a tendency to get places naturally, but have a little bit of control over where you put your glue. But that's pretty good right there. And then all we got to do, I'm going to take our dirt for our stocking on top. There's a few holes in it, so I want to make sure there's not too many big holes. Make sure it's nice and taut, and then just sprinkle it over. And you can go pretty thick on this, because once you're done, you're going to either, if it's a module or a diorama like this, you're just going to turn it over and tap it off after an hour or so. Or if it's on a layout where you can't do that, you're going to vacuum it up. So go ahead and go pretty heavy on this. Make sure you cover everything pretty well. And same thing there. You can already see where it's starting to soak up the glue and turn darker. So that's why we mix in that grout. You can also use, if you can't find, like, you don't have to drive all the way out to Central Virginia if you want a certain particular shade of dirt. You can just buy red grout and use that. That's going to be perfectly fine as well. It's just what the dirt does. And you know what? I forgot to, it's not too late. You don't need much, because this is actually going to be your field. But just a little bit. Just to add some texture. But you can just find like a red or a gray tile grout, and that'll work just as well. Yeah, but now you can see I'm going to put that over there, and that kind of blends in the color. And come right up to the edge here. And make sure there's no holes. All right, simple as that. All you're going to do is let that dry for about an hour or so. It probably doesn't take that long, but just to be safe. And then, like I said, either tip it over and knock off the extra dirt. You might need a second layer depending on how thick you want it to go. Or take a vacuum, a shop vac, and just vacuum it up. But that's really it. We're going to do the exact same thing here and here once these dry up. Oh, there is one last thing I wanted to show. Now, so it's been about half an hour since we started. You can see this is pretty hard now. It's kind of like a clay consistency where it's not quite soft, but it's definitely holding its shape a lot more. Now, like I was mentioning, this is going to be kind of where our building's going to go, and I want a smooth area for the building to go on and for sort of a parking lot out front. What we can do, if we want to have a smoother surface, I need one more cut. No, we'll just use this. I'm going to go in the garden anyway. So, here, anyone want some latte? I'm just going to take the water. And what you do is, just take your water. You want to dip your fingers in it and just run your fingers over the top like this. Smooth it out. What it'll do, it'll sort of re-wetten it won't reactivate the plaster per se, but all the high spots will flow into the low spots, and you'll still get this sort of lumpy contour, but you can already see there, it's a lot smoother. We don't have nearly as many pits. And so this is perfect, like I said, if you're working on a dirt road, or a foundation for a building, or a walking path, or even just like a hill, like a rolling hill where you're going to have some grass on it and not much trees. You can kind of see there. There we go. So if you compare that to that, you can see it's a lot smoother. It's still got the sort of grander lumps. So it looks like the contours of the dirt, but now the actual texture of it is a lot smoother. And you can do this in multiple stages. I probably should have done this a little bit earlier, honestly. But you can do it at the 10-minute mark and then again at the 20-minute mark and just keep working at it. You can apply a little bit of pressure too, because again, it's kind of got like a clay consistency. Whoop. Sorry, just gonna put water on that. Here we go. Until you got the texture. Then, again, for Sculpted Mold, you've got about a 30-minute working time. If you get Celluclay, it's going to be more like 24 hours. So the brand is going to affect how much time you got to work on that, but the process is exactly the same. But that's basically it. You can see we went from here, painted it, added some rock stain, and then put our dirt on top. And what we're going to do, the last step, which I can't demonstrate right now because again I got to let that dry, is you're going to seal this down with more scenic glue, and you're going to use more like this thinner mix to make sure it flows. But if you just use this, even with the drop of soap in it, because it's water, it has surface tension, it's going to try to beat up. What we do to combat this is isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol has no surface tension and actually breaks the surface tension of anything that comes in contact with it. So what you'll do is you take either a spray bottle or a eyedropper and go over with, it doesn't really matter the strength of isopropyl alcohol, the 70-30 works just fine as the 90, it really doesn't matter. And you just barely soak the dirt with the isopropyl alcohol. You don't want to go super heavy because then you risk it actually washing away the dirt. Just enough to make sure that it's saturated. You do that all over. And then you come back with the glue. You can try to use a spray bottle. Have you ever been able to use a spray bottle without it clogging up within 30 seconds? No. That's what I thought. Okay, so you can try to use the spray bottle for about 30 seconds, but then what I actually end up doing is using the eyedropper and going over all of the stuff that's been coated in alcohol, and it'll flow in between all the particles, soak into the dirt, and then that's the step. Because it's so thin, that's going to take about a day to dry. And so you need to just let it sit. This is the longest part of doing scenery, is waiting for this plaster to dry and waiting for the scenic glue to dry. These couple steps we're doing right now, we're looking at about 5 or 6 days of work all told, just for waiting for glue to dry. That is the patience part of doing scenery. Once that's done, all the trees and bushes and cars and stuff, you can do that in a couple hours. It's just this beginning steps that you have to have the patience for. But obviously, you need to have the foundation to make sure all your details actually look good. That's about it. Any questions? Yes.
If I wanted to skip the Sculpted Mold and paint directly on the foam, would I have to do anything differently?
Nope. It works exactly the same. You might have to go a little bit heavier with the paint, so that make sure the paint doesn't show through. But no, there's no reason. If you're just like modeling just a flat field or something, or you just don't feel like doing the plaster step, yeah, you can just go flat, cheap latex paint right over the surface of it, pretty thick, and it'll work just fine. Yep.
Could you put glue in with it?
Like I said, I've heard it done. I haven't tried it myself, and the one guy I heard it from, the next video, he was back to letting the glue dry and putting glue on. So there's It's like a compromise step if you're really pressed for time, but honestly, I would just go through. It only takes like an hour for the house paint to dry. So I would just wait for the house paint to dry and put on the glue. Honestly.
Where do you get the plaster?
The plaster? Unfortunately, they used to sell it at Michael's. They don't anymore as far as I know, at least not in the one in Virginia Beach. I found it online. I just got it off Amazon. Like I said, there are different brands. This is the Sculpt Mold. Here, let me grab it back. This is the Sculpt Mold brand. This is my favorite. It's a little bit on the expensive side. There's also a brand, like I was talking about, called Celluclay. It comes in a much larger bag with a yellow splash and a red logo. You'll see it in the back shelf. Again, the formula is a little bit different, but it's basically the same stuff. If anything you can find of this modeling compound, you might be able to try, like, there's smaller art supply stores. I think there's a place called like Jerry's Artorama in Virginia Beach. You might be able to try. But I've just found this online because unfortunately they don't have it at Michael's anymore. All right, any other questions?
One thing you can do if you were pressed for time, and I've seen it done, when you put your paint on, if you're going to put grass or dirt over it, well, the paint's still wet, sprinkle it on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can do that
It's
too.
not great.
It's not, yeah. Yeah, if you got like an open house in 5 hours and you try not to get into that position, but
Paint faster too.
yeah. All right, well, if there's no other questions, thanks everyone for coming by again. Next time what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate static grass, which is fun. So thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful day. I got it. I want to do it this time because last time the video just didn't upload for some reason. I don't know why. So I'm gonna, yeah.